The key to an energy transition, which is also sustainable here, is to provide enough energy for a growing population, a richer population, a population that globally needs a massive increase in its energy services being delivered, not necessarily in primary energy level. We need more efficient energy as well. And then what will be the end result of that in terms of cost developments? What type of trajectories will we be on in a few years? When we think about things like the necessary capital into this, the necessary sources of minerals, metals, and what's that going to cost us? And where do we find the possibilities of a sufficiently low-priced energy to ensure the necessary development?
Welcome to Smarter Markets, a weekly podcast featuring the icons and entrepreneurs of technology, commodities, and finance, ranting on the inadequacies of our systems and riffing on ideas for how to solve them. Together, we examine the questions: are we facing a crisis of information or a crisis of trust? And will building smarter markets be the antidote? This episode is brought to you in part by Abax Exchange, where trading in centrally cleared, physically deliverable LNG and carbon futures contracts is now underway. Ready for smarter markets?
Welcome back to Inside the Coffeehouse on Smarter Markets. I'm Dave Greely, Chief Economist at Abax Technologies. In this podcast series, we're introducing you to Coffeehouse, Smarter Markets' new social media platform for advancing the conversation on energy, climate, markets, and technology. It's a space where the executives and icons you listen to on our podcast can engage with each other in thoughtful conversations, disagree without being disagreeable, and discuss how our market systems can be redesigned and improved to address the most important challenges of our time, including climate change and the energy transition. That feeling of grabbing a cup of coffee with colleagues to catch up on the important issues is what we're creating on this platform, and our Smarter Markets members are invited to follow the conversation. If you'd like to learn more about Smarter Markets Coffeehouse or join our waitlist, visit Coffeehouse at www.smartermarkets.media. Building new markets begins with the exchange of ideas. Many of today's great exchanges were born in coffeehouses, including the New York and London stock exchanges. At Smarter Markets, we're building our virtual coffeehouse to facilitate the exchange of ideas that will lead to the smarter markets of tomorrow. We have two guests joining us today: Susan Sakmar, visiting professor at the University of Houston Law Center, board member at Flex LNG, and author of Energy for the 21st Century: Opportunities and Challenges for LNG. And she's joined by Eirik Wærness, senior vice president and chief economist at Equinor. We'll be having a transatlantic conversation on the future of energy following the U.S. elections, with them sharing their perspectives on what it may mean for the U.S. oil and natural gas industry, LNG, and Europe. Hello, Susan and Eirik. Welcome back to Smarter Markets.
Hi.
Hi, David.
Thank you both for joining us on the podcast today. I've been looking forward to getting a real transatlantic energy conversation going following the U.S. elections. And I thought I might start with you, Susan. I'm curious how you would describe the mood in the U.S. energy industry and the LNG industry in particular following President Donald Trump's win. And how important do you think President Trump's announcement that Chris Wright, the CEO of Liberty Energy, as his pick to be the next Secretary of the Department of Energy, is to shaping that mood and what we should expect?
Okay, an easy question. I think we saw after the election of President Trump a huge surge in the market. The entire market, I think, there's a collective sigh of relief. We now know who the president is going to be. And by the way, it's not President Trump didn't just win the White House, but also Republicans won the Senate and the House. So that's significant as well. It was a sweep across the board. So I think the mood initially that we saw was favorable within the market, but also the energy market, because it's clear, Trump on the campaign trail is in favor of energy, fossil fuels, and he is in favor, obviously, he has said, drill, baby, drill. Now, question, the industry really wants to do that or not. The market will decide that, but he's clearly in favor of the energy industry. So I think the mood is positive. And I think within the LNG industry, everyone sort of expects that one of the first things President Trump will do will get rid of the LNG pause enacted under President Biden. And we can talk about that later. I think the second part of your question was how significant is it that Chris Wright, the CEO of Liberty Energy, has been nominated as Secretary of Energy? And I think it's very significant. One, he's coming out of industry. He is a fracking company CEO. But in my view, when you read what Chris Wright has written and what he has said, I think it's really an effort to change the narrative that we've had for 4 years, right? For 4 years, we've had a sort of energy transition, climate change narrative. And I think President Trump is going to change that significantly. And I think nominating Chris Wright is a step in a different direction. And then it remains to be seen how it plays out, because we're still in early days, right? We still have 2 months before President Trump takes office. So it's still early, but you can already see a change in direction happening.
And do you have a sense of what that new narrative could be?
My sense is we'll be talking a lot less about the energy transition and, what's going to replace that. Chris Wright talks a lot about energy poverty. I guess I see his main focus when you read some of the things that he's written, and don't just take it from me, you can go and look. There's something called Bettering Human Lives, which is a nonprofit that Chris founded. And some of the key takeaways from that is that Chris Wright believes energy is good. Energy is a driver of economic development. Energy is a way to alleviate poverty. And so I think we're going to see more of that narrative. Now, is the next thing that everyone's going to be talking about alleviating energy poverty? I don't know that that's going to be a replacement for energy transition, but I think we're going to see a whole lot less emphasis on energy transition. But it's not quite clear what's going to replace that.
And Eirik, what's the mood in Europe, both in, broader policy circles and the energy industry as well?
I think generally the mood in Europe is a lot of mixed feelings in different dimensions. I think the case is that the reality is that Europe is also in a position where it's struggling to find its place, its role in the geopolitical scheme of things, in a world where relationships between China and the United States and Russia is affecting Europe. Europe is the second largest economy in the world if you take it together, but we don't act like it. We're not able to act like we're the second largest economy in the world. Europe is energy poor, if you're talking about energy poverty, because we have to import a lot of our energy, like China, like other regions. So in that sense, there's a mixed feeling. There's a wait and see attitude, I think, in terms of what the actual policy changes will be in different dimensions in the United States. A bit of the paradox in terms of the energy narrative as well is that it's in the next term, it's under Trump's presidency that we will see some of the first larger impact of the Inflation Reduction Act. We're in a long-term industry. And changing the narrative now in terms of LNG or drill, baby drill or whatever will have an impact on the short-term food and the short-term investments. But in terms of energy output or changes in the energy mix, that will be for the next presidency. So that is also a bit of the paradox here, I guess. A situation where you could foresee more energy becoming available out of the United States, out of North America is interesting for Europe, if that were to be the case. But on the other hand, that depends on the protectionist movement as well, and whether that energy will be reserved for domestic manufacturing in the United States or not, or will they allow for higher gas prices on natural gas as a consequence of increased LNG or not? So there's a lot of uncertainty around that. The worry is, of course, that, we might have more energy available, but we're in a much less business-friendly environment because of tariffs and protectionism. And Europe is a very open economy. The United States is one of the most closed economies in the world, where exports is only 10% of your GDP and imports is 15%. In the case of Europe, it's 50% of GDP and 55%. So Europe is much more dependent on the overall trading environment. It doesn't help having more gas available for European manufacturing industries if those industries cannot export products to the United States and other countries in the same manner as we had because of tariffs. It's a bit of a mixed. The German trade surplus with the United States is the third largest. The United States trade deficit with Germany is the fourth largest in the world. It's China, it's Mexico, it's Vietnam, and then it's Germany. In order for Germany to keep its competitive edge, it needs energy, but at the same time, it also needs the market. It's that combination of potentially more energy available, but in a setting which is a bit different in terms of tariffs. It's mixed feelings. It's a wait and see attitude, I would say.
I want to dig into the tariff piece a little deeper with you because President Trump's first term, he created a lot of tension with his NATO defense spending ultimatums. And as you said, this time tariffs are pretty high on the agenda. And given Europe's vulnerability and Europe's need to find its kind of place in the world, I guess, how do you think Europe might respond if it kind of gets caught in the crossfire of a tariff war with China?
That is a very difficult issue. First of all, the security issue is still on the agenda. The worry about the United States' attitude towards NATO and European security is, of course, even more important now than it was in the previous Trump term because of the war in Ukraine. But then with tariff, it's a really difficult issue for an open economy like Europe. Europe has the disadvantage that we've been talking about a common market in Europe between what used to be the 28 member countries, which is now 27 after Brexit, plus the EEA countries of Norway and a couple of other countries. We've been talking about a common market for 30 years, but it's not really there yet. It's not as strong. We don't trade sufficiently well within Europe. As a consequence, we're extremely dependent on our international trade, and therefore the United States as a trading partner is more important for us than Europe is for the United States. And also with China on the other side and other countries. And then we're struggling with how to respond to that because fundamentally, we are in a situation in Europe where energy costs are high. Energy is really important for the energy-intensive manufacturing engine that we have in Germany in particular. We see now also a lack of strong leadership. We have a German government on its way out. We have a French government, French prime minister that is a minority government and weaker than what we normally are used to. And we are in a transition phase with the same EU Commission coming in and taking office right now, but trying to establish itself with a slightly different political balance in the European Parliament. For how long will we only see EU having a global role on things like climate policy? Will we drive the energy transition discussion as strongly as we have? This is exactly the same question as you had in terms of moving from a Democratic to a Republican president now. That energy transition dialogue, will it be slightly different? In a world where we now have to face up to protectionism and tariffs and a very polarized geopolitical landscape. So there's a lot of uncertainties here. And we don't have a common fiscal policy in Europe. So we don't have the ability to debt finance whatever we want to do like the United States does for a while. It's a competition here as well with very different starting points and very different positions. In spite of EU GDP or European GDP is almost the same as the United States, right? But it's different.
And I wanted to come back to you, Susan. It's kind of amazing. It feels like the Russian invasion of Ukraine has been going on a very long time, and it has, but it wasn't happening during President Trump's first term. So there have been big changes in the LNG markets since President Trump's first term. You've had the Russian invasion of Ukraine, sanctions on Russian natural gas, and U.S. LNG really becoming an energy lifeline to Europe, and the U.S. becoming the largest LNG exporter in the world. And I'm curious, as you look ahead to the next 4 years, what do you see as the opportunities and challenges for U.S. LNG during a second Trump administration?
First, it's interesting that U.S. LNG had, two wildly transformative years under President Biden, right? The president that most people would say isn't as LNG friendly as President Trump. And yet LNG has always done well under Democratic administrations. It was the Obama-Biden administration that first allowed LNG exports. So I just point that out because it's always interesting to me when I reflect on administrations, and sometimes the rhetoric doesn't necessarily match what happens. So what do I think going forward? We had the Russian invasion of Ukraine under President Biden. U.S. LNG saved the day, according to some, and really was a transformative period for the U.S. LNG industry. We now have the US LNG pause and quite a few projects sitting on the sidelines. Some of it is regulatory and legal issues that will be tough for any president to change the outcome of some of the issues going on. But I think under Trump, we're going to see, this goes to what I see already as a different narrative. Trump was not a war president. He has already said he wants to end the war in Ukraine. And so I think that's going to happen. And so what does LNG look like when the war in Ukraine ends? This is one of my sort of wild predictions I'll make. Well, maybe it's 50-50, because it seems to me President Trump wants to pursue a policy of growth. And so growth historically, in my view, has come from, two ways to grow economies, global economies, is war or ending wars and rebuilding. And so I think one of the things that could very well happen sooner rather than later under President Trump is there's some resolution to the Ukraine-Russian conflict, and what could be a growth opportunity for the US and also for Europe and for German manufacturing is rebuilding Ukraine and rebuilding some energy infrastructure. So I see that as a big opportunity for Europe and the US. But it also represents, you asked for opportunities and challenges, it also represents a potential challenge, because I don't know what that means in terms of Russian gas. Does pipeline gas come back to Europe or not? That's going to have to be sort of determined. So I think that's also a potential challenge, whether or not Russian gas comes back or not. And if so, how? Is it pipeline gas? Is it LNG? Or I guess a more perfect world where global economies are growing, all of that energy is needed. So Russian pipeline gas, more can go to China, more LNG can go to other markets that are underserved, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Vietnam. And so in a perfect world, there's enough growth where all of that energy is needed. And so it doesn't have to be such a zero-sum game.
Well, that's an interesting scenario I'd like to ask you about, Eirik, in that if there was a resolution, do you see Europe ever going back to its reliance on Russian natural gas to the same degree it had pre the invasion of Ukraine? And how would Europe feel about being reliant on US LNG? And you said earlier that Europe, in effect, is an energy poor region. Do you think Europe needs to rethink its kind of extreme reliance on one supplier or another? And what's its path to being less reliant on these large degrees of imports, if there is one?
It's a bit of both, I guess. So first of all, if you look at it from a European perspective, the US LNG or North American LNG is an option for somebody who has to depend on imports for its energy requirements. It was an option that was there that could be utilized to some extent when we were in dire needs in Europe in terms of having to replace about 30% of our gas overnight. And Europe took that option. Even Germany, who didn't have the option of receiving LNG, they had to build regasification terminals to be able to take in LNG, right? And they did in record time. And then Europe realizes that it has to pay for it, right? And the United States should export its LNG to whoever pays for it. And that will be Asia, or it will be Europe, or it will be both. And Europe paid for it in 2022, and we took then all the free LNG in the world out of the global market, with the result that Pakistan and Bangladesh and Thailand and Vietnam didn't get that. Other countries in Asia didn't get that LNG, and they had to resort back to more coal than they otherwise would have. And that's how that market is going to function. I think it's very difficult to see that Europe, if we were to have some kind of peaceful resolution in Ukraine that in many ways, we all should hope for. It's a terrible tragedy going on there, and both for the Ukrainians, of course, but also for the Russian soldiers that are on that front line. That doesn't mean that we will have a geopolitically very benign climate, it doesn't solve all the other geopolitical issues that are around. I don't think the European importers of gas would suddenly shift their attitude towards sanctions against Russia, suddenly make themselves as dependent on Russian gas as they were. I think the notion of keeping optionality will still be there. Gradually, probably import slightly more, even open up for even more LNG. We import a lot of LNG, or Europe imports a lot of LNG from Russia as well now. But the type of dependence and single source supply that Germany was a victim of, I don't think that's going to come back anytime soon. Anyway, how do you then handle that? Well, you have multiple sources of gas. We're going to utilize the regasification terminals in Germany for LNG from Qatar or North America. Germany has entered into long-term contracts now with Qatar up until 2053, I think. So optionality. The energy transition will, of course, also focus on reducing the fossil fuel dependence of the parts of the European economy where that is possible via electrification of transport. Hopefully, we'll see from European perspective that the part of decline in gas demand, that's a consequence of deindustrialization. It's something that we don't like, but we should get back. And then, of course, it's also about building much more renewables where it makes sense in Europe. That is also part of the energy transition. So it's going to be a mix of both. But of course, a solution to the war is important in and by itself, but mainly because of the human catastrophe, the possibilities of rebuilding one. I mean, this is Europe's largest country, the Ukraine, right? The only part the European country that's larger is Russia. So it's big and it's necessary. But it won't mean that US LNG is going to be uninteresting overnight from a European perspective. And I think in the US, seen from a US perspective, this is a market. This is about maximizing the value of your energy resources, using it. Part of it's domestically. If you accept slightly higher prices, then you're going to export more. And then you're going to sell that, knowing the Americans, you're going to sell that to whoever pays the most. And that might be the Japanese or it might be the Europeans,
Yeah, and given that US LNG will be needed in Europe for some time, Eirik, I wanted to ask you, it's not only the highest price, it's also the regulatory environment. And in Europe, it's been fairly forward in some of its climate regulations, moving forward with the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAM, and its methane regulations. How do you think the desire to implement those regulations while also dependent on US LNG will play out for the future of US LNG in Europe?
In a sense, it's a dilemma. It's a give and take. In a protectionist type of world where we are fighting against each other on trade policy, the paradox is that things like a carbon border adjustment mechanism might actually fit very well into the political climate. But of course, Europe will have to balance that against its own energy costs. The methane regulation is not only European policy drive, it was part of the signed agreements at COP28 last year. Things are happening from the business side of things with OGCI, where the American companies are also part of that. So there are things happening on the methane regulation, but of course, how much can be done? I mean, from an economic point of view, methane leakage is a bad idea. It's bad because if you get rid of the leakage, you can sell more gas. But of course, it's a cost-benefit type of investment. We don't have any methane leakages in the Norwegian pipeline system. It is possible to get rid of, but of course, it costs money, especially if you're onshore and with long distances. So that's going to be playing out also in a market, more of a market-based thing. And Europe will have to balance the impact of its own carbon border adjustment mechanism policies on its own competitiveness as well and find ways to do that. And as I said in the start, Europe is much more dependent on global trade policies being conducive to competition than both the United States and China are, because you guys are in a closed economy, relatively speaking. You depend much more on your own internal trade.
I want to come back to you with that in a minute, but I want to bring Susan in. Although you did raise a great point. I think often people who aren't as close to it sometimes forget that natural gas is methane. So if you're leaking methane, you're leaking natural gas, you're leaking your product. And why do you want to leak a product that you could sell? Obviously, it's costly to prevent them, but there's certainly an incentive there. I wanted to turn to you, Susan, and ask, as we've got this booming US LNG export industry that's continuing to grow, how central is Europe to the business plans of US oil and gas producers, of LNG exporters? And how important are European environmental policies to their business plans? Now, are they focused particularly on the European market, or was it really just kind of the broader global export markets?
I think Europe is very important. I think all of the US projects, well, with the exception of Freeport, maybe, which is all Japanese off-takers, the US projects do have a lot of European off-takers. And one thing that's really important is your off-taker for the US model needs to be creditworthy. And so the European off-takers are creditworthy. A lot of emerging Asia off-takers are not creditworthy. And so the US LNG model really relies on the creditworthiness of the buyer. So I think Europe is very important in that regard. So I think Europe is important. And I think when you look at, for example, Cheniere, and you mentioned methane and the European regulations, I think Cheniere is a company that stands out to me as saying Europe is important and we will do what needs to be done to ensure our US LNG will have a home in Europe and comply with European regulations. So I feel like some of the companies, especially Cheniere, which is the largest US LNG exporter, is taking the lead on looking at methane emissions from the source of the natural gas, from the gas that's being sourced. And Cheniere just released a new life cycle emission study that they think will comply and meet European regulations. And these are the regulations that are going to impact the imports of US LNG in a couple of years. I've been saying sort of on social media that I do think there needs to be, I'm calling it harmonization, but that's sort of a term of art. I think there probably needs to be some more coordination between the US government and European governments in terms of how the European regulations are going to roll out so that US LNG isn't excluded. And I just the other day saw something come across social media that the US and Europe are looking at that. So I think under Trump, we're going to see a lot more and hear a lot more about how European regulations will impact US LNG. I think that is still coming because in my view, it's a bit unclear how the European regulations, how they're going to be implemented. And I think from what I've heard from some lawyers, it's a bit unclear on European buyers. You know, can they sign new US LNG deals and will those deals be valid in 20 years if European regulations are now requiring European buyers to look at the emissions of the full value chain, which is pretty hard to do, right? A European buyer, has to look at the emissions of the full value chain of US gas. I mean, it's hard for US producers to come up with that number. And now we're sort of putting that on European buyers to make sure that it's going to meet the European regulations. So I think under President Trump, we're going to hear a lot more about that and how that's going to roll out.
And Eirik, I wanted to come back to you because you said something earlier that really got my attention. We were talking about some views you shared the other day about how the European Union handed its energy security to the United States and its energy to Russia, and that it needs to rethink its place in the world. And you brought up, how kind of similar to China, Europe is somewhat energy poor. And what we've seen in China is that there hasn't been so much the tension between the transition to renewables and fossil fuels because security and renewables kind of both go in the same direction. And I'm curious, could we see something like that play out in Europe as well, where, more nuclear, more renewable, more solar, more wind, not only keeps the energy transition moving to low carbon, but also helps Europe increase its own energy security? Do you think the narrative in Europe, because of its conditions, will stay energy transition, even while the US, with its abundance of oil and gas, might see more of a tension and might move away from the energy transition approach?
First of all, it's also an important element of this is that Europe not only handed over its security to the United States and its energy to Russia, but also its commodity production to China, like most other countries did. And then where is Europe finding itself now? Where renewables make sense in terms of both on affordability-wise, decarbonization-wise, of course, but then also in a world where we're focusing increasingly on security of supply, that makes sense. And the increased focus on offshore wind where it's possible, etc., in Europe, it fits very well into that because it does address all those three dimensions. To a certain extent, the affordability is a bit questionable, at least for now. The issue is, of course, that as opposed to China is the key delivery. It's the key source of all the technologies that we need. They own and they control and they provide everything we need in the supply chains, both for solar, for steel, for wind turbine blades, etc., etc. So that China develops its own renewables, also with a focus to increased energy security, is relatively obvious. It's not that obvious for a region like Europe, where we would depend on them, like the United States, we would then depend on Chinese supply chains. You immediately get into issues on human rights and those types of issues around ESG and where do you source from. And we will depend on another country for key input factors to the energy transition as well, whether we're talking about batteries or solar panels or wind turbines, right? I mean, one of the paradoxes is, of course, that a lot of the solar industry started out in Europe, but ended up in China. That is something that Europe will have to find the right balance here. We'll have to find it in a situation where we do not act necessarily as one large entity, but as 30, 35 different countries, depending on who you count in. To some extent, we compete with each other. We don't have a common fiscal policy. And we're still struggling on the regulation side here as well. I mean, what we just talked about in terms of defining what is acceptable in terms of methane emissions in a value chain and allowing for LNG exports from the United States and imports into Europe is something that where the regulation is still being formed and shaped as we speak. So, and that's an issue not only for the US as a seller, but also for Europe as a large buyer. It's an interesting negotiation there, right? I don't think Europe realizes that it is potentially very important for the United States as a buyer of LNG with companies that are creditworthy, that can provide bank guarantees for actually being able to pay, et cetera, et cetera. And then it's about sitting down and realizing that on both sides of the table.
Well, I want to thank you both for a really interesting transatlantic conversation so far, but I'm not letting you go yet. Because I thought in the spirit of our new Smarter Markets Coffeehouse, where we're letting our guests and contributors engage directly with each other, I feel like I should let each of you ask a question of the other. Maybe I'll turn the microphone over to you first, Susan. What are you most curious about Eirik's perspective on right now?
My question for you, Eirik, is, you said Europe is struggling to find its place. So I'm just curious if you could pick one or two things, one or two recommendations, what would they be?
I think my recommendation would be that add on where Europe definitely punches above its weight, or at least at its weight, is in global climate policies, where it has ambitions and it wants to drive the world in the right direction. To me, it's a big paradox that we don't do that in other dimensions, in other variables, given the size of Europe, given how many we are, given how rich we are, given our cultural and historical traditions. I would wish Europe would demonstrate clearer to the world some of the other aspects of European culture and life as a model for other regions to think about, look through, and react to. Where else do you find a group of countries with very different cultures, languages, and religious transitions that are as well equipped to cooperate as we have proven over the last 80 years? Why isn't that a selling argument for being European? And it's a model for other countries or other regions in the world to think about what other aspects add on to the number of variables where Europe wants to play a role on top of our climate ambitions, right? That's what I would wish. And I'm not even a member of the EU. I'm Norwegian.
But obviously impacted, right?
I like your perspective on what will be the United States' interest towards the rest of the world with the election result now and the next 4 or 5 years. Will the US be mostly concerned with issues that is surrounding around its own development itself domestically within the borders? Or will it be outwardly oriented? Will it have an opinion about where the rest of the world is going? Is it going to be defensive? Or is it going to be open to provide solutions? Is it going to be enormously transaction oriented? What's in it for me or not?
Well, so America, I guess under Trump, yes, it is Make America Great Again. Right. And, I don't know. That's not what I picked, but that's what the administration has picked. But I think maybe under his second administration, he will have learned maybe some lessons, right? Hopefully. And maybe it will be a little more, because I think business is a little more collaborative than that, right? I mentioned Cheniere doing a life cycle study. So there are plenty of businesses that are saying, hey, wait a second. We like the energy transition narrative. We're ready to play in that world. And We're meeting methane regulations. So I don't think Trump can just come in and, scrap everything. I mean, I think he has to listen to business. And since we're mostly talking about, the energy and the LNG industry, there are a lot of divergent views. And so I think he's going to have to be mindful of some of, I said, I think the energy transition narrative is going to change. And I do think it is, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be just completely scrapped, because there are a lot of players that like that narrative. And there's reasons to keep the narrative. There's a lot of work being done in the US on a variety of things: hydrogen, direct air capture, renewables. So I think some of that continues. So I'm hoping it's going to be a little more nuanced and collaborative, because I think the world and the business world is more nuanced and collaborative than Trump sometimes comes across. But I think at the end of the day, Trump is a forceful leader who really is concerned about America first. And the fact that he had such an overwhelming victory, I think, says that most Americans are concerned about America. So, there's, I guess, enough problems in America that most Americans want to solve our problems first, and Europe and Ukraine second. That's why I think that war is going to end, because I think Americans in this election have essentially said, we're tired of focusing on Europe and the world and that narrative, and we want some things taken care of at home. So I think Trump, and that was a lot of his campaign narrative, is really focused on the US, right? I did see European leaders on day one sort of like stand up and say, oh, we got Trump back. We have to stand on our own a little more. Right? And so I think that expectation will be rolled out by President Trump. I'll just sort of reveal that my favorite politician in the world is Selena Meyer from the HBO series Veep. She's a very offensive politician, a bit like Trump, I mean, she'll say things that are quite offensive, but there's one episode where her tagline is, everybody just needs to man up. And so I've been like saying that to my family. I have kids. I'm like, yeah, come on, everybody just needs to man up, and everybody has to take care of their own house and then try to help others. But first, you have to take care of your own house. I feel like that's where Trump is coming from, right? And so to the extent that impacts Europe, I think Europe's going to be pushed hard again under Trump to kind of man up. If you need energy, America has energy, and enough with the endless regulations. Because Trump definitely has said that in the US. It's one thing to have regulations, and I'm a lawyer, by the way. So, I understand regulations, but, you can overregulate to the point of paralyzing industry. I think Trump clearly has said we want to eliminate all of the regulations that are holding us back. And I think he's going to push Europe to do the same, with the goal, again, my vision is a global growth vision. And I think that's Trump's vision too. There is a path to growth, but we all have to kind of man up and take it. And it won't be easy, but I think there is a path to growth. I think it would be good, but I think that's where the Trump administration is coming from as well. That's my prediction. We'll see as it rolls out.
There are only big questions on everyone's mind right now, so that's good to know. And thank you both for working through some of the answers with us. And as we go, I just wanted to ask each of you one more question. And I thought I'd start with you, Susan, since you wrote the book on energy in the 21st century. And that's, we might not have all the answers yet, but what do you think are the big questions that we should be asking as we think about what's going to determine the future of energy going forward?
Well, I think the big question, and it's almost maybe always the question that you have with energy, is it can be pretty simple. Do you need energy to grow your economy? Do you want to grow your economy? Do you need energy to do that? And if so, then what kind of energy? Eirik's mentioned, Europe is an importer. The US has been blessed now to be an exporter, but we weren't an exporter 10 years ago, right? We weren't a very big energy exporter 10 years ago, but 10 plus years ago, the US knew it had shale gas, but it wasn't easy to produce this shale gas. And I spent a lot of my time on environmental issues related to shale gas. And there were moments in time where it really looked like U.S. shale gas was going to get shut down due to environmental concerns. This is going back to the 2012 election when Obama had to win Pennsylvania, and Pennsylvania was a very big fracking state. And the Obama administration backed off on some of the push against fracking. And then fracking took off, U.S. LNG exports took off. And so for the record, I was a bit squeamish because there are a lot of environmental issues with fracking. And I was concerned that domestic gas prices would rise too much. And Eirik, you mentioned that concern in terms of U.S. industry. So I was a bit too cautious. I look back now and I'll just say, I was wrong. I was a bit too cautious. And I didn't have enough, faith in American industry to be able to produce enough gas in an environmentally friendly enough way to keep prices affordable. But U.S. industry did. And so I guess sort of the recommendation is for any country is you have to look at what you have. And if you don't have any energy, but you want to get energy, then figure out the best option. And it's not going to be perfect, right? And so I think sometimes countries paralyze themselves with waiting for the perfect energy source, and it has to meet all kinds of environmental regulations, and it has to be really cheap. And there's no perfect solution. So you just have to make a decision and move forward. And that was a decision. And part of what's informing I'm now less squeamish about energy production, in part because I remember a meeting with UK regulators and the Texas Railroad Commission, which is the Texas oil and gas regulator. And this is going back again 10 plus years. The UK was coming to the US and wanted some insight on fracking. And they were really bogged down with all the environmental issues of fracking. And could the UK produce its shale gas? And after about 10 minutes, the Texas regulator just sort of stood up and had enough and said, well, I'm leaving and you just need to decide whether you want to do it. And if you want to do it, then do it. And I'll remember that to this day because I feel like countries and business leaders just need to decide we need energy. Here's what we think is the best option. Then just do it. And you can paralyze yourself thinking too much, which is what I did. I mean, that's why I'm saying I learned that lesson 10 plus years ago. I overthought it because in the end, everything turned out okay. It's a long answer to, I guess I should probably just say, countries just need to decide what the goal is. And if the goal is we need energy to grow our economy, then pick your best shot and move forward with resolve. And things will probably work out okay. But don't paralyze yourself too much with too many what ifs and too many regulations.
Well, thank you, Susan. And I'll let you have the last word, Eirik. What are the big questions you think we should be asking as we think about the future of energy today?
I think what is the fundamental issue here is to think through what will be the capital requirements or capital cost developments, and then also sort of what will be the end cost of some of the new sources of energy that we will develop here. The key to an energy transition, which is also sustainable here, is to provide enough energy for a growing population, a richer population, a population that globally needs a massive increase in its energy services being delivered, not necessarily in primary energy level. So we need more efficient energy as well. And then what will be the end result of that in terms of cost developments? What type of trajectories will we be on in a few years? When we think about things like the necessary capital into this, the necessary sources of minerals, metals, do we really think the world will be able to deliver refined rare earth elements in quantities that are 10 times larger than today by 2035? And what's that going to cost us? And where do we find the possibilities of a sufficiently low-priced energy to ensure the necessary development? In the northwestern part of the world, if you look at a normal European-centered map, Europe and North America, we are in the situation where we have enough energy. It's about replacing some sources of energy with more efficient sources or less carbon-intensive sources. But in the rest of the world, this is about providing more energy to ensure development at the same time within the sustainable constraints of the global development. And then it's about what is this going to cost us? We'll have to learn a lot over the next 4 or 5 years to see where that is going.
Thanks again to Susan Sakmar, visiting professor at the University of Houston Law Center, board member at Flex LNG, and author of Energy for the 21st Century, Opportunities and Challenges for LNG. And thanks also to Eirik Wærness, Senior Vice President and Chief Economist at Equinor. We hope you enjoyed the episode. We'll be back next week with another episode of Inside the Coffeehouse. We hope you'll join us.
This episode was brought to you in part by Abax Exchange, where trading in centrally cleared, physically deliverable LNG and carbon futures contracts is now underway. Ready for smarter markets? Contact us at onboarding@abax.exchange. That concludes this week's episode of Smarter Markets by Abax. For episode transcripts and additional episode information, including research, editorial, and video content, please visit smartermarkets.media. Please help more people discover the podcast by leaving a review on Apple Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, or your favorite podcast platform. Smarter Markets is presented for informational and entertainment purposes only. The information presented on Smarter Markets should not be construed as investment advice. Always consult a licensed investment professional before making investment decisions. The views and opinions expressed on Smarter Markets are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of the show's hosts or producer. Smarter Markets, its hosts, guests, employees, and producer, Abax Technologies, shall not be held liable for losses resulting from investment decisions based on informational viewpoints presented on Smarter Markets. Thank you for listening, and please join us again next week.